It has been 1 year since the start of the revolution, and despite numerous minor battles and skirmishes, neither side has been able to land a decisive blow. But in New York, both armies are now concentrating their forces, and the first major campaign of the war is about to begin. Following British General William Howe's withdrawal from Boston, the Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army, George Washington, has correctly predicted that the British will next move against New York. For the British strategy to defeat the revolution where it began, the city is well located to strike into New England through the Hudson River Valley, while also boasting a large port to supply armies from the sea. Unlike Boston, New York is also a loyalist stronghold. In the countryside, civilians have been intercepting Continental messages and capturing supplies, while entire militia companies eagerly await the first opportunity to defect. Even after the battles of Lexington and Bunker Hill, many colonists still hope that George III will act as a conciliator between Parliament and Congress. These hopes are dashed in 1775 by both the proclamation of rebellion in London and the failure of the final petition from Congress to the King. Tensions are further escalated after the Governor of Virginia, the Earl of Dunmore, issues a proclamation offering freedom to slaves who join the British Army, stoking fears of slave uprisings across the 13 colonies. Public support for independence rises further in 1776 with the publication of the widely read and persuasive pamphlet Common Sense by the revolutionary Thomas Paine. In April, local governments across the 13 colonies begin making moves towards independence, and some 90 declarations are issued by July. With news of foreign mercenaries joining the British Army, a negotiated peace seems less and less likely, and moderates in Congress begin to be swayed towards independence. In June, Thomas Jefferson, a delegate to the Continental Congress from Virginia, is asked to write a draft text for the Declaration of Independence of the 13 United States of America. The text is finally approved by Congress on the 2nd of July, 1776, and a new nation is born. The eloquently written preamble becomes one of the greatest triumphs of the Enlightenment and will go on to inspire millions of people around the world. Although much of the indictment of the king is political propaganda, the key arguments are clear. Independence is justified to stop Parliament imposing taxes and legislating laws without the consent of the colonists. After the declaration is signed, the king's image and insignia are removed across the colonies, except in the small pockets under loyalist control. Royal coat of arms are removed from churches, courthouses and taverns, while the king's name is removed from legal documents and government buildings. Statues are torn down in front of cheering crowds, and effigies of the king are burnt. In New York, Washington has gathered some 19,000 men to defend the city. He begins training the army and organizes his men into divisions, mixing both his militias and enlisted troops. Washington is unsure of their readiness for battle and believes the freedom his men enjoy make them undisciplined and unreliable soldiers. He tries to inspire the men by having the Declaration of Independence read aloud and instill discipline by instructing that those who retreat without orders are to be shot. Washington writes that he seeks a defensive war, a war of posts, where large battles are avoided in favor of defensive engagements behind forts and entrenchments built across the Hudson River, Manhattan, and Long Island. Washington knows that the British have limited resources, particularly manpower, and cannot hope to win a drawn-out war of attrition in America. Washington also faces strategic challenges. British control of the sea enables the rapid deployment and concentration of force, which could be used to encircle the Continental Army. Washington must also maintain control of the Brooklyn Heights on Long Island, which provide commanding views of southern Manhattan, and if captured, would allow British guns to bombard the city. In an impossible situation, he decides to split his forces and break a key rule of war. On the 3rd of July, General William Howe, commander of British land forces, begins disembarking his men on Staten Island. Delighted loyalists come out to welcome the army as liberators, and the local militia defects to the king's colours. General Howe's brother, Lord Richard Howe, is Commander-in-Chief of British forces in the Americas and controls the Royal Navy fleet on the coast. Both the Howe brothers want peace and are sympathetic to the American cause. As well as attempting to defeat the enemy, the Howe brothers are also peace commissioners. This makes prosecuting the war effectively problematic, as the bloodier the conflict becomes, the more difficult it will be to achieve peace and reconciliation with the colonists. As British forces mass to 32,000 men on Staten Island, Lord Howe sends letters to Washington to open negotiations. But disagreements over etiquette slow any meaningful progress, as Washington will only receive letters that correctly address him as general, which Lord Howe, likely to his frustration, is not permitted to acknowledge. Regardless, Lord Howe has been unhelpfully instructed to only negotiate after the colonies fully accept Parliament's supremacy, an uncompromising position that will never be accepted by the colonies. With negotiations going nowhere, on the morning of the 22nd of August, General Howe begins landing troops on Long Island, which soon totals 20,000 men, including 5,000 Hessian mercenaries. They are further reinforced by over 600 loyalists and 800 escaped slaves who come to join the British cause. Washington has been convinced that the main attack will come directly to Manhattan and the city of New York, and he has neglected the defences on Long Island. After several days, Washington begins to realise that the recent British landings will in fact be their main attack, but he still only sends limited reinforcements and keeps most of his army divided in an attempt to defend two places at once. Washington has 3,000 to 4,000 men spread across the heights and over 6,000 defending Brooklyn. The hills, which are up to 150 feet in height, are an ideal place to make a stand. They are covered in woods with only narrow passes cutting through, providing Washington with an opportunity to make the British wade through much blood and slaughter before retiring in good order to the Brooklyn Heights. British generals Henry Clinton and Charles Cornwallis had led the landings onto Long Island. Soon afterwards, Clinton begins to reconnoitre the rebel defences. A loyalist farmer informs Clinton that the Jamaica Pass on the right is guarded by just 5 Continentals, a significant oversight by Washington and his second-in-command, General Putnam. Clinton devises a plan to distract the American front, while half the army moves behind the heights to turn their flank. He takes the plan to General Howe, and although the two men despise each other, Howe agrees, and the British prepare to attack on the evening of the 26th of August. At 9 p.m, British forces begin their advance. They leave campfires burning so as not to arouse suspicion, and Clinton takes a crack brigade forward on the right with fixed bayonets. They are led towards Jamaica Pass by local farmers who know the way in the dark, and a column of 10,000 men follows silently behind. Howe has taken a significant risk as his column, stretched out over 2 miles, is severely vulnerable to surprise attack should the Continentals have caught wind of the plans. But his movements have remained secret, and at 2 a.m, Clinton's advance party reaches a tavern just outside the Jamaica Pass. British officers ride into the narrow gorge and soon find the 5 patrolling Continental soldiers. The Americans mistake them for comrades and fall into formation with the British officers before being swiftly captured without a shot being fired. Howe has successfully maintained the element of surprise, and his men slowly begin to cross the heights. On the left, British General Grant moves earlier than instructed. With a roar of musket fire, 300 regulars storm the pass. The Continentals initially flee, stunned by the early morning attack, but soon regroup on the hill. The American command is woken to the sound of drum rolls and troops marshalling for battle. General Lord Stirling is responsible for the American right and moves forward with his 1,600 men. Twice Grant's regulars attack the hill, and twice they are repulsed by the now organised Continental Army. In the centre, the Hessians under General von Heister begin bombarding the hills, and his men line up for battle with their well-dressed uniforms, drums beating and flags waving. But they do not move. Continental General Sullivan and his men confidently watch the Hessians, who they are eager to fight, and Sullivan sends reinforcements to Lord Stirling. The battle has so far gone as expected for the Continental Army, and Washington arrives in Brooklyn to take command of the battle. But at 9 a.m, the situation is about to dramatically change. 2 heavy cannons are heard from somewhere behind the heights, and to the shock of the Continentals, British forces are spotted advancing through Bedford Village. The 2 cannons have signalled General von Heister's division to finally push towards Sullivan's headquarters at Flatbush Pass, and the advancing mass of blue uniforms and flags now begins to intimidate rather than amuse. As the trap quickly begins to close, the Continentals on the left have been taken completely by surprise, and the rout is almost instantaneous. Pennsylvanians at the end of the line break at the sight of the enemy to the front and rear, and the men at Bedford Pass get caught up in the retreat. Despite sporadic resistance, the last Continental formations in the centre are surrounded and forced to surrender by 11 a.m, while General Sullivan is captured by Hessian Fusiliers hiding in a field. On the British left, Grant is now pushing Lord Stirling slowly up the road toward Brooklyn. But Delaware and Maryland Continentals, in close formation with their colours flying, continuously counterattack and keep the British in check. Stirling, unaware that the rest of the line has collapsed, soon becomes a victim of his own success, and General Cornwallis is able to block his retreat with Scottish Highlanders on the road to Brooklyn. The fighting reaches its most savage of the day as the Continentals, now surrounded, look for a way to break out. Stubbornly holding on, Stirling eventually orders the majority of his men to retreat across the 100 yards of marshes behind them. He takes 260 Marylanders forward to protect the withdrawal, and valiantly attacks the Highlanders again and again until they are almost all killed to the man. The men retreating across the marshes flee for their lives in panic, and many of the soldiers who cannot swim get stuck in the mud and cry out for help. Despite the horror, the majority eventually make it back to American lines, covered by fire from their countrymen in the Brooklyn fortifications. Stirling, after making a final charge, is adamant not to be captured by British troops and finds a Hessian unit to surrender his sword. By the afternoon, the British have pushed forward to the outer works of the Brooklyn defences, and Clinton is poised to lead the assault. They outnumber the Americans 3-1, and Washington seems within reach. But General Howe knows that his campaign cannot afford large-scale losses, and he takes the controversial decision to pull back his troops. Howe may have feared a repeat of Bunker Hill, but it is a decision taken bitterly by his men, and to the surprise of the Continentals. After the war, many would accuse Howe of letting his American sympathies become treasonous for failing to press an attack that would have almost certainly have succeeded in Brooklyn. As the day ends, American losses are likely over 1,000 dead and wounded, and 1,100 captured. British losses are under 400 killed and wounded. Washington partly blames the defeat on his undisciplined men, who are unwilling to do their duty. But it is in fact his own staff's failure to properly guard the flanks that ultimately sealed their fate. In the following 2 days, a storm hits Long Island. The high winds prevent the Royal Navy from cutting off Washington's retreat, as Howe had hoped. The British Army follow a textbook approach, and dig trenches towards the American lines. Trenches bring Howe's men closer and closer to the defenses, and they are almost ready to strike. But Washington has other ideas. Taking advantage of a thick fog, the Continentals row across the river back to Manhattan in the dead of night. Although the battle has been lost, the withdrawal is conducted perfectly, and Washington saves his army from almost certain disaster. Following the defeat, the American position in Manhattan becomes precarious, and in early September, Congress gives Washington permission to abandon New York if necessary, but forbids him from burning the city as he desires. His army begins its retreat north and becomes increasingly strung out across Manhattan. Howe, having done nothing for 2 long weeks, finally moves on the 15th of September and begins landing troops at Kip's Bay. American morale disintegrates, and to Washington's horror, organized resistance quickly collapses. He writes, "Are these the men with which I am to defend America?" Having landed in the middle of the Continental Army, Howe is well placed to cut off well over 3,000 retreating soldiers in the city. But inexplicably, he does not move his army, and Washington's men are able to retreat unmolested across Manhattan to fresh defenses in Harlem. In New York City, crowds welcome British troops as they march through the streets. Roles are reversed, and loyalists now take revenge against patriots that had previously tormented them. Not long after the British arrive, a fire breaks out that destroys a quarter of the city, and the rest is only saved by a strong wind that stops its spread. The true cause of the fire remains unknown, but many suspect Washington secretly gave the order to deny the city and its large port to the British. The next day, on the 16th of September, probing attacks are conducted against Harlem Heights, and Highlanders are pushed back in a bloody skirmish. Howe rests his men and waits 3 more weeks before advancing further. The break gives Washington time to organize his army and bring in much-needed reinforcements. Howe hopes to avoid further costly battles and instead force a surrender by encircling the Americans in Manhattan. He lands at Pell's Point, but stiff resistance buys Washington time to withdraw most of the army north. Howe again slowly pursues and leaves half of his army in Manhattan, surrounding the still occupied Fort Washington. On the 28th of October, Howe's army arrives at White Plains, where Washington has built strong defensive positions. As the British march towards the Continental Center as Washington has planned, the British instead strike against a tall hill anchoring the American right flank. Hessians are initially repulsed, but British reinforcements eventually capture the strategically important hill after bloody fighting. The British suffer some 250 casualties in the attack, likely twice Continental losses. But they now hold the dominant hill on the field, and Howe is in a strong position to attack again the next day and envelop Washington's army. But he again pauses. In the following days, while Howe ponders his next move, heavy rains cover the battlefield. Washington does not waste time and once again uses the weather to hide his movements and successfully withdraws further north. Instead of pursuing Washington's army further, Howe decides to march back south against the garrison at Fort Washington. The gun batteries, along with Fort Lee on the opposite bank, are preventing Royal Navy ships from freely entering the Hudson River. But due to the fort's poor construction and weak outer defenses, the 3,000 men holding it are vulnerable. Despite the danger and Washington's own misgivings, his officers convince him that the fort can be held, and the men are not withdrawn across the river to safety. Sensing an opportunity, on November 16th, British and Hessian troops attack from multiple directions with a force 8,000 strong. The Continentals doggedly resist in the outer works, but are slowly pushed back until the Hessians burst into the redoubt at Bayonet Point and force a surrender. The battle is a crushing and unnecessary blow to the Continental Army. Washington has lost some of his best trained soldiers, along with a significant number of much-needed cannon. In an unusually aggressive move, in the following days, Howe sends General Cornwallis to land upstream from Fort Lee across the Hudson River. The surprise landing almost captures the garrison, who hurriedly escape after being tipped off by a local farmer and quickly abandon the fort, leaving behind further stores and cannon. In late November, General Cornwallis pursues Washington south into New Jersey, as the bulk of the British Army begin to move into winter quarters. Although the capture of New York has been significant for the British, General Howe has missed a number of opportunities which could have transformed a tactical victory into a crushing strategic one. Nonetheless, battles have been won, loyalists across the country have been emboldened, and the British now occupy a critical port that they can use, along with bases in Canada, to strike deep into New England the following year. For the revolutionary cause, the situation is now dire. At the start of the campaign, the army numbered some 19,000 soldiers, which was further bolstered by thousands of reinforcements along the way. But morale has now plummeted, and dozens or even hundreds desert or resign every day, and the militia leaves in droves. By the end of November, Washington has less than 7,000 men in his army. To all eyes, the revolution looks on the verge of defeat. As Howe begins to contemplate his plans to end the war the following year, Washington and the collapsing Continental Army fall deeper into New Jersey, and perhaps the most desperate period in American military history. A genuine thank you for watching our series on the American Revolution. Please consider liking and subscribing, or leaving a tip with the thanks button below. You can also join our YouTube or Patreon membership community to get early access and vote on future videos. Thank you again, and until next time.